Silicon Valley Bank. Now, I'll be honest, never heard of this bank before, but apparently everyone in financial circles did because they had tens of billions of dollars. They had Mr. Wonderful from Shark Tank tipped a whole bunch of money in, but unless you've got under $250,000 in the bank, it's all going to go. What are your thoughts on what this means about the upcoming situation with the economy, but also a woke management style?
But here's what your audience needs to picture. Picture you have a bank in your country that is very woke, that is spending its time investing in going nowhere green energy projects, obsessing over how many Black people do we have on the board? How many women do we have on the board? How many LGBTQ people do we have on the board? And instead of having all that energy channeled into how are we managing our financial investments and the health of this bank, they're worried about things like that, okay? And then when you look at their board, did they fill it with people who understand how to invest, how to hedge their investments? Boy, we're really heavily into U.S. Treasury bonds. That's actually going to be a really bad investment if the Fed hikes interest rates over and over and over, which we know they're likely to do if we have sustained inflation, which everyone's saying there will be. Instead of finding people to sit on the board who can manage that kind of risk, they put one investment banker on their board, but touted the fact they have 45% women. 45% women. I don't know what the women were doing. What I read is that it's all Clinton and Obama mega donors who literally were in tears after the 26 election. One had to go to Japan to some Shinto shrine to cry for days to recover. This is what their board was doing, okay? They weren't managing the shop or the risk. So they overly invested in these risky, as it turns out, government treasury bonds, which the other banks saw coming. The other banks also saw that they could buy treasury bonds for a very low rate and very low interest and make a lot of money. But they knew if we get too heavily into those, it's going to come back to bite us in the butt. So they didn't overly invest in those, and they were protected. Not this bank. It wanted it all. It wanted to have this risky portfolio and this wonderfully colorful, diverse board and to pat itself on the back for all. And then it failed. And then it totally went over a wonderful lifestyle, George Bailey run on the bank, where the people were like, what? They admitted they needed $2 billion to cover a shortfall. And then people were like, oh my God, we're not insured for anything more than $250,000 deposits. The vast majority, something like 91% of their investors, had over $4 million in the bank accounts there. These were not mom and pops. These were rich Silicon Valley investors who were savvy, who knew what they were doing, who had assumed the risk for the most part. And they made a run on the bank. They all started withdrawing their money. Holy cow. And then they lost $42 billion in a day. And then the feds had to take over. They've now been bailed out. Our government looks at us and says, don't worry. The taxpayer's not going to pay any money. You and I both know that even though technically the other banks are stepping in to save it, the banks don't suck up those costs. They pass them on to us. So now in the end, these far left wokesters have won. They ran this bank into the ground. They promoted their stupid left causes, which went nowhere. They managed to save their deposits, even though they knew there was no guarantee for anything over $250,000. And we, the consumers, are going to wind up having to pay the bill.
And these are the same people that all whinged about the bailout that happened in 2008 because, greedy right-wing bankers were getting away with it. Perhaps the actual lesson here is that you have a scenario where if the government is constantly going to bail out this sector, then it doesn't matter whether they're of the crazy left or the greedy right or the Martian people. If they know that in the end the government won't cop the pain of just letting these things rip, then can you imagine how irresponsible these banks are going to be in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, and it makes one wonder, how would this administration have reacted if this board had been full of Trump donors instead of Clinton, Biden, and Hillary Clinton and Obama voters? How would they have reacted? Would they have stepped in? How would they have reacted if they knew that Joe Biden's policies hadn't played a major role in this bank's collapse with the, spending like a drunken sailor and then trying to overcorrect the necessary and predictable inflation that happened as a result of that by hiking rates, which pinched a lot of people who were trying to borrow money, including this bank that was heavily invested in the bonds. Like, they had a hand in it too, the Biden administration. So they didn't want this on their conscience. They're trying to tell us all, don't worry, this banking fund is going to cover all the losses. Since when did the banks take huge losses to cover the butt of another one without passing it on to the little guy? You and I both know that mom and pop sitting in the middle of Iowa are going to get increased bank fees. They may not do it right away, but they're going to do it. And as a collective, we are going to have to cover this loss. And what's it going to lead to? More banks making similar choices because they know if they're important or essential enough, the government's going to have to step in to save their butts. As if we've got big money trees growing out in the backyard that just can continue to fund these problems, which, that attitude is what got us in this position to begin with.